Hi Becca.
Hello.
So in this video we want to look a little bit at the question of how should the Bible change me? We've talked quite a lot about studying the Bible in different ways and using our intellect, which is important. But we've also touched on the fact that it's not just about building up knowledge. Actually, we want it to lead to love and worship and a changed life. It said that in the passage we read from 2 Timothy, all scripture is God breathed, and it trains us, it equips us, it rebukes us. Therefore, it should change us as we read. And it makes me think of this passage it's in Matthew as well, but in Luke chapter 6, the wise and foolish builders, which is quite famous words, but I'll just read it. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they're like. They're like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When the flood came, the torrent struck that house but couldn't shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete." And that's specifically talking about the words of Jesus, but all of the Bible in some way really is the words of Jesus, God to us. Do you have any reflections on that? What does that make you think of when you read words like that? I find it quite challenging, personally.
Yeah, it is challenging. I think we live in a culture where we expect instant gratification and everything can happen very immediately. Like, if I need something for my house, I can go on Amazon Prime and order it and it will arrive the next day.
Yeah.
And similarly with the Bible, I think we can approach it and think, I want to get something out of it immediately, and I want, God to immediately transform me and change me. But actually, there is a kind of work that the Bible expects you to do. And ultimately, we have to allow it to change us and shape us and transform us. We can't just kind of read it and be like, I'm going to instantly change. But there is actually something that we have to do, a response that we have to have. And it can feel, for me, a lot like reading the Bible is just really hard work. And like the wise builder, it probably felt like quite hard work when they were digging into the foundations and trying to build well. And it can be really tempting to build on the sand. But at the same time, as that passage shows us, that actually there is a kind of steadiness and a transformation that comes when we build well, when we listen carefully to what God says, and allow it to change us.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit of passage I had to preach on Sunday, last Sunday in 1 Timothy 6. Somewhere in 1 Timothy 6, where Paul commands Timothy to pursue certain virtues, like he says, pursue righteousness, godliness, love, faith, steadfastness and gentleness. And that, I think, ultimately comes through pursuing a relationship with Jesus. But I think actually we should be coming to the Bible expecting that as we read the Bible, these sorts of virtues should be grown in us. Partly because we see them in characters in the Bible at times, but often we don't. We see the opposite. But principally because we see that God, and ultimately climactically in Jesus, who embodies these virtues most beautifully. We think, I want to be like him. I want to imitate God. We're called to imitate God. I want to imitate God in these ways.
And I think that's easier in some parts of Scripture than others. And I think what was helpful when we talked about the big story of the Bible is that I find it easier when I read the letters to see how I should respond to Scripture. The letters of Paul, largely, of being like, I need to love people or enact that. Like, I think of the passage in Romans 12 of the list of ways in which we can be the church, of outdoing one another and showing honour and be zealous and all of those things. But actually what I think is helpful in the grander story is that there is kind of permission for that to recognise that is about us, and those are direct instructions to us. Whereas the other parts of the story, the other acts, allow us to kind of read it in their position in the story, see how it is relevant to the rest of it, but we can allow it to change us in a different way. So I can read the story of Judges, for example. We've talked a lot about Judges, and see how there are certain characters in that, like Samson, for example, who in a lot of ways doesn't do godly things, and in a lot of ways does do godly things, and think, actually, my response to this passage isn't to directly emulate Samson, but it's to take what God is showing about who Samson is and what he did that was godly, and the ways in which he demonstrated the character of God, and allow that to shape the things that I do and the way I act.
And also, which we'll come on to more in the next video, but also in their failures and in their successes, but particularly in their failures, how they point to Jesus, because Jesus is the greater Samson who succeeds where Samson fails. And then, as you see Jesus in that story, you want to emulate Jesus ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess practically, how do we read the Bible in a way where we're pursuing these kind of virtues, where we're seeking him to change us through it? And for me, one thing that comes to mind is reading it in a kind of meditative way. So I think in the last video we talked quite a lot about reading the big story of Scripture, and maybe reading the Bible in a year or 2 years or 3 years or however many years it takes you to getting through big chunks, which is, I think, really helpful. I also think it's really helpful to read just small bits, or if you've read a big chunk, meditate on 1 or 2 verses within that chunk which really stood out to you, whether it's I don't know if you've had experience of Scripture memorization, but whether it's memorizing, whether it's writing it down, putting it places, trying to let it dwell in you and change you as you kind of live in those verses. Have you had much personal experience of that kind of reading of the Bible, or others that you know who have done it?
Yeah, I mean, I had a mum that was very pushy in that area, not in every area, but and also led a lot of children's work. I think it's something that kids' work they're really good at doing, of thinking about ways that we can kind of get Scripture into us, and memorising, and there's often the incentive of sweets if you've learned the verse or whatever it might be.
Always good. We should do that for adults too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there are some parts of Scripture that I've learned, and then I mean, there's quite a lot of songs that I find it really easy to remember, and so for me, something I found helpful in memorising Scripture is putting it to music and listening to Scripture as well, because I think sometimes when we read the Bible, we might not often read it aloud, but actually hearing it as well as just reading it is a really helpful practice for me to be able to actually let that dwell in me, and to kind of remember the things more. And that doesn't mean that we need to know specifically exactly where every verse is, but having the verse and allowing ourselves to come back to that verse and use it as something to meditate on is helpful. I mean, I know quite a few people who have all memorised Ephesians. I don't know why specifically Ephesians. It's a great book, but and it can be a helpful practice in just learning it. But if you just learn it, it doesn't necessarily help you. But if you are able to learn it and then repeat it to yourself, then it can allow those kind of Scripture truths to take root in you. That's what I found most helpful with memorising and learning things. Yeah,
I've not personally done lots of Scripture memorisation. I feel like I know quite a few verses off by heart, but not because I've actively memorized, just because I've read and reread them that many times that they've kind of gone into me. Possibly something I should do more of, but I do think for me, just rereading passages over and over again, the more we read the Bible, the more we immerse ourselves in it, the more these things kind of become part of us and our way of thinking. It doesn't mean you need to know, you don't need a bonus mark to know exactly what verse and chapter and everything it's in. Although the benefit of that is you can find it when you need to check it, and but it's the truths that are contained with it which is more important. This isn't, because the danger of this kind of thing is it always becomes like a competition and to show off. I know this much Bible off by heart, or I know where everything is in the Bible, or I know these weird names in the Bible which have no practical relevance to your life. When actually the heart of doing it is to humble ourselves before God and His Word, that I'm submitting myself to His Word, that these things become treasure. talks about in Psalm 119 the law, which in that context is kind of the scriptures. Then you is it's like honey on my lips, and this. And do we have that kind of attitude towards the Bible? Well, I think probably often we don't. We give it a few minutes here or there if we're lucky. We relegate it below other priorities in our life, when actually I think God's asking us and calling us as a church and as individuals to really take this. If we want to be disciples who are making disciples, let's take this book much more seriously and really treasure it. The other thing, there's I think something called the Discovery Bible Study. Have you come across the Discovery Bible Study? Which is quite a helpful way. What are the questions they ask in that? Do you remember? Or any of the questions? I can't remember. There's a few questions. Can you remember anything?
Oh yeah, well.
It doesn't need to be in exact order, but there's a few questions.
What does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about us? What do we do? Is that one of them?
I think what do we do? What are we going to do about it, or something? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're helpful questions because, just again, in terms of actually not just skimming a passage and saying, right, I've done it, but actually, it just helps us dwell it. Like actually stop and think, ask these questions, practical questions, and I like the order of it. Like, what does it tell us about God? Like before we get to us, before we get to what we're going to do, which is important, but let's start with where God is in this passage. And as we look at Him, going back to what you said in the first thing about beholding God, as we look at Him, we will be changed. So those three questions, I think, what does this tell us about God? What does it tell us about humanity or about me? And what am I going to do about it? It's not mechanical. We don't have to ask those questions every time we read the Bible necessarily. But especially if you're starting out trying to get a bit deeper in a passage, there might be a helpful framework just to use.
And particularly in groups with other people, when we're reading the Bible in community groups or discipleship relationships, because I think there's that element, for me anyway, of accountability, that if I say, oh, when I read this passage, it makes me want to share Jesus with my neighbours, or whatever it might be. It allows someone else to maybe a week later say, oh, you said when we read this that you would want to share Jesus. How's that gone? What's that looked like for you? And it allows us to kind of have the accountability that reading scripture isn't just an exercise that's on our own, but can change the way we treat other people and the way that we worship God and help others to disciple us in that.
Amazing.